Thank you, Dr. Panosian, for the kind introduction. It is an honor to be here. Can you hear me? Better? Can you hear me? Okay, good. It's an honor to be here to speak to ARPA about the healing power of stories. In ARPA's spirit of research, I come to you not only as a writer and as an artist, but also as an anthropologist. That's the research side of me. And as an anthropologist, I'm devoted to human diversity and also to our unity as a species. Now, many good things have come to me through anthropology. I first met Dr. Panosian through anthropology with ARPA's efforts to bring Armenian archaeology out into the forefront, and then through that, Dr. Areshian has contributed a beautiful study on Ani to the textbook that I co-author. As a medical anthropologist at the University of Vermont, I made stories a critical part of student doctors' training. Now, as you can imagine, some students didn't like this so much. They rejected stories. They thought this is sentimental, this isn't scientific enough, and wasn't relevant to the hard science. But then when a story touched them, they shifted. Over time, I came gradually to telling my own stories. First in the graphic memoir Alzheimer's about my mother and dementia, and most recently in my verse novel, Like Water on Stone, a story about the Armenian Genocide. Now, narratives about genocide, like those about mental illness, they often evoke feelings of hatred and of shame. When they appear in the news or in the media, sometimes they come with a listener warning or an advisory that the contents might be inappropriate for children. We were just speaking earlier about what age is my book Like Water on Stone appropriate for? Where do you draw the line with the violence of the genocide? Now, some of us turn away from stories of genocides, as our parents and our grandparents may have done, and others of us have devoted our lives to engaging with them. Some of us do that in order to heal, while then there are others still who say that these stories reify the darkness and the hatred and the pain. I feel that if we, as descendants of the genocide, are to find our place in today's world, we have to spend time thinking about our relationship to these stories of such terrible times. Can they foster healing? Can they actually do that? Well, an anthropological perspective on healing and how stories have functioned for thousands of years show us that the answer to that question is yes. Now, in research, we make cases by lining up facts and then telling our audience about them, whether it's in a research paper or in a lecture. But writers are always striving to do something called showing instead of telling. Our stories lay out what we're feeling. So before I give you any theoretical models of how stories heal, I want to show you what happened to me as I wrote about the genocide and about dementia, and how engaging with the deepest truths about those tough experiences ended up being healing. Now, the idea of putting genocide and dementia together might have some of you thinking, how am I going to get through this night? Can I just slip away before it gets too painful? Well, I promise you, it's not going to all be sadness, and I also promise you that I haven't denied any of the painful truths. What I want to do is blend together my anthropological toolkit with examples from Like Water on Stone and Alzheimer's, and use them to show you why stories, especially stories about phenomena surrounded by stigma and shame or denial, must and will play a critical role in our continuing recovery. Stories let us find ways to deal with pain because characters in stories manage to accomplish what seems unimaginable to us in our own lives. Now, this is something I learned from my mother early in dementia. One May morning, she stood by my dining room windows and she was looking out over the rolling fields, and she sang this bit from the Rodgers and Hart musical, Babes in Arms. It seems we stood and talked like this before. We looked at each other in the same way then, but I can't remember where or when. The clothes you are wearing are the clothes you wore The smile, you were smiling then, but I can't remember where or when. And then she stopped and she smiled and she said, that should be the Alzheimer's theme song. Alzheimer's. Now my mother, Aravni Mashoyan, let's see if I can do this. There. Was born in 1933 in New York City to parents who were both genocide survivors, and you see her there with her older sister Rose. She always attributed her father's brooding spirit, and he was Vanensi, to the loss of his sons and his first wife during the genocide. And I have only the very haziest memories of this grandfather, Yarishe, who died when I was 6. My mother said that every night, after supper, with a shot of cognac, her father cursed the Enver Pasha for what he did to the Armenians, followed by cursing Christopher Columbus for discovering America. But after Yarishe went to Yerevan in the early 1960s, he dropped the Columbus part. My grandmother, Oridar Droshagirian, she died long before I was born. She was a 10-year-old girl when she fled from her home in Palu. When I was about that age, I asked my mother to tell me one day about her own mother's childhood, and she replied, after her parents were killed, she hid during the day and ran at night with Uncle Benny and Aunt Alice from their home in Palu to the orphanage in Aleppo. That sentence haunted me until I was able to write like water on stone. Uncle Benny, and you can see him here, that's Vartan Troshagirian. He changed his name to Ben Flag, spelled with 2 G's. That's Oridar, that's her older brother Haruchun, his wife Mariam, and they met in the orphanage, and Haruchun and Mariam's daughter Tatar. Uncle Benny and Aunt Alice, who's not in that picture, were colorful characters in my childhood, but I knew very little about their lives or how they survived, because in my family, as in so many Armenian families, we didn't speak about the genocide. And by the time I thought to ask the serious questions, that generation was gone. So when I wrote this book, I had very few facts to work with. I know that from the orphanage, with the help of a Keri, a maternal uncle, they made it to New York. I know that somehow a pot came with them, of all unlikely things, and my Armenian American relatives argue over who should have it. I think it's in Niagara Falls right now, though no one talks to those cousins, so I don't know for sure. I know that they were a family of millers from Palu, and one older brother escaped to the east. And today, his great-granddaughter, Shushanik Troshagirian, is leading a project at Yerevan's Tumos Center to make an animation of Like Water on Stone. And we don't have any pictures of that yet, but this is Shushanik's previous animation that you can see on their website. There was an older sister who was married to a Kurd, and today her grandson owns a series of restaurants in the Netherlands and in Turkey, all called Harput. And many of us know that Harput is now Elazig and not Harput, so I'm so looking forward to meeting him and talking to him and finding out, how he kept that name going all these years. Now, growing up in New York, Tanabur, Pilaf, Lahmacun, Küfte and dolma graced our dinner table. And George Mogurtichian and his now Sounds of the Middle East album provided the soundtrack, but my family was not a part of a big Armenian community. My mother had married an American, an Odar. And sometimes I wondered about my mother's decision. Was it on account of her parents' Dashnagaram-Gavar marriage? Or was it to get away from the tragedy? Or was it to try and rise in American society that my mother made this choice? I can only guess. Among my mother's first cousins, it's striking that only 1 or 2 of them married Armenians. This exogamy, and that's the anthropological term for marrying outside the group, was atypical among diasporans of that time period. It's more common now. But still, in her own way, my mother longed to connect to Armenia. So, in the summer of 1977, my family had a chance to visit our Yerevansi cousins. I was 17, about to go to college. I was enchanted. I had never tasted such apricots. I can still see the light shining through the windows in that market on Mashtots Pohot. One night we managed to slip the in-tourist guards, and I spent the night with my cousins in their apartment. They had mattresses stacked in the corner of one room, and then a dozen or so mattresses got laid out on the floor at night for everybody to sleep on. The visit was overwhelming for my mother, seeing the poverty, wondering how her life might have been if her parents hadn't landed in New York. We left nearly all our possessions behind with our cousins when we left. So I went off to college in the fall, ready for the first time to really embrace my Armenian heritage. I joined the Armenian Club at Columbia University. I read everything I could about the genocide. I filled my language requirement with Western Armenian, learned how to read and write. But I remained an outsider for two reasons. I don't look Armenian. I have fair skin, freckles, auburn hair, and I don't have an Armenian last name. So my half-breed status was all too visible. But the second reason was political. At Armenian Club meetings, I was advocating for the importance of recognizing other genocides, such as Cambodia's killing fields. And that was so fresh and raw in the early 1980s. But that's something we're talking about now in 2015. But in the early 1980s, we weren't there. So gradually, I came to believe that I wasn't the right material for an Armenian marriage. And around this time, my mother, overwhelmed with the responsibilities for the relatives in Yerevan, she broke off all ties. I remember one day a letter arriving and my mother just tearing it in half and saying, "That's it, I can't do this anymore." So as time went on, like my mother before me, I married an Odar, a foreigner, a non-Armenian, a wonderful man who plays the oud. Our oldest son, Mishan, once asked me if music was our religion. I too made tanabur, lahmacun, kufta, pilaf, and dolma. And like my mother, I was still yearning to connect. So in the summer of 1984, Peter and I traveled to Western Armenia, historic Armenia. We took a ferry boat from Istanbul with a car. We'd rented a car in Paris, across the Black Sea, landed in Trabzon, and from there drove inland all around the east, eventually down to Cilicia, and then across to Smyrna, today's Izmir. Now during that trip, I kept my identity hidden. I was hidden like the ancient structures that were scattered across the landscape that were labeled only as church or fort. But it was funny, when I was alone on the street without my husband, people spoke to me in Turkish first. And I had learned enough of the language to reply in kind for that trip. Now, secrecy was an especially good thing that summer. 1984, Los Angeles, what was happening? Anyone remember? It was the Olympics. The Olympics. And the Armenian radical group, Asala, demanding recognition for the genocide, had turned to violence. And their threats to the Turkish Olympic team caused the team to withdraw from the games in Los Angeles. So every day that summer, in the Turkish newspapers, there was an anti-Armenian story on the cover of the newspapers. So we kept our mouths shut. We were a couple of young American kids bopping around. In Mush, a Turkish family, according to the hospitality traditions of the region, invited us home for dinner. They fed us tanabur, pilaf, lahmacun, kufta, and dolma, and they said to us, "I bet you've never tasted anything like this before," and we nodded. I shared the truth of my pedigree exactly twice. The first time was in a tea shop in Kars. It was 3 weeks into the trip. We arrived in Kars with a carton of Marlboros for the bribe to get into Ani. A young man in the tea shop started saying things in Turkish that made it clear to me that he was Armenian. I explained to him then that my mother was Armenian and my father was American, in Turkish, in my broken Turkish, and then he borrowed my Turkish dictionary and he paged through it until he found the word mongrel. And he pointed to it and he showed it to me. He said, "Yes, you're a mongrel," with a huge welcoming smile. So he brought us home to meet his family. A giant loom filled the main room of the house where his sisters sat side by side, nodding, carpets. He told us about the time that he had spent in prison on account of his Armenian identity. The second time that I shared the truth was in Palu, Oridar's long-lost home. We approached Palu. Maybe I can do this. That would be better. We approached Palu via the unmarked church. Perched on top of the hill above the town, its roof missing and its walls defaced. And then in town, we asked if there were any mills nearby. That was one of the few things I knew. My parents' ancestors were millers. So we were sent across the bridge, a modern one that was built over the one of crumbling stone with 8 arches. And then we followed the river's bank up to a fast-flowing stream and then headed up the stream into the woods until we reached the mill, a series of attached buildings running up the slope like a stepping stone. On the rooftop of the largest building, a headscarf lady of the house served us sweet tea in clear glass cups, and a half-dozen children with big brown eyes watched and listened, mounds of apricots dried in the sun. When I asked her about the mill, she said that it had been in her family for 60 years. But then she said to me that before that, it had belonged to Armenians. That's when I told her the truth about my family. We held each other's gaze for a moment as the water hit the mill wheel and the stones of the stream. And for that one moment, the Turkish official policy of denial evaporated on that rooftop. It took me many, many years to process that journey. At first, I processed it through artwork, through a series of dry point images, and you make dry points by gouging into a metal plate with a hard metal object, so with a diamond pen or a steel tip into a sheet of copper. But it was not until 25 years later that I started writing like water on stone. And when I did, from Palu, oh, I got ahead of myself. That's what happens when you can't see when you're clipping. Yeah, there's the dry points. And now we're back looking at Palu. From Palu, I remembered, and you probably remember this too, the color, the water of the Euphrates, the eastern branch of the Euphrates. It's so green, and the hillsides are pink. I remember walking through the woods. I remember finding the mill. I remember mounds of apricots drying in the sun. I remember the ruined church. And from books and from my wounded relatives, I knew the violence and the horror. From anthropology, I knew that distinct biological races don't exist. And I knew the dangers of summing up groups of people and then writing them off. From that trip to Turkey in 1984, I knew firsthand what it felt like to be one of them, the hated other. And I also knew the importance of separating individuals from horrible acts of governments, because as anthropologist Gregory Stanton has shown us in his model of the stages of genocide, this kind of classification is genocide's first pernicious first stage. So when I sat down to write the story of the 3 siblings, Shahin, Sosi, and Mariam, who made a journey from Palu to Aleppo, all of these different fragments had to come together to tell some kind of truth, to reflect each of these truths. And when I began writing, the form of the story, which is free verse, found me rather than the other way around. I hadn't been writing poetry, I was more used to writing prose. But everyday language can't express the scale and the horror of genocide. We've severed heads, rape, rivers red with blood, stinking heaps of dead bodies, the living emaciated, naked, sunburned, marching through the sand. We all turn away. I could only put it onto paper in fragments that slowly accumulated into a story. Now the book, like Water and Stone, is told, I might have gotten ahead of myself again. Oh, okay. It's told as a series of dramatic monologues. First in the voices of the 3 siblings, fraternal twins, Shahin and Sosi, who are at the cusp of adulthood, and then their 5-year-old sister, Mariam. Each piece of the story starts with the name of the speaker. Now, far into the writing process, I realized that I needed a way to make the reader feel safe as they were reading. And this is how the next character came into being, Ardziv, the eagle. As I wrote, Ardziv made it safe for me. He made it safe for the reader. He made it safe for the young ones as they traveled. But more than just a magical being, Ardziv embodies the strength of spirit that lives inside of each of us. Ardziv opens this story, and I'm going to read to you the opening right now. Balu, 1914. Ardziv. 3 young ones, 1 black pot, a single quill and a tuft of red wool are enough to start a new life in a new land. I know this is true because I saw it. We track our quills when they fall, always. With eagle eyes we can see from the sky who picks one up from the ground or rescues it from the crook of a bent branch, the quill's mottled color blending in with peeling bark. It was the girl who picked up my quill. She and her mother worked side by side, plucking frothy white beetle bodies from leaf and stalk. They crushed them between fingertips and used this insect blood to turn their carpets the richest red. Clever. When my feather dropped, the girl, the older one, Sosi, almost full grown, her body budding, stirred from her work. The little one, Maria, napped on a carpet beside her. Sosi, named for plane trees that stand tall on this land, her short, quick inhale as she saw it tugged the air around me. She wiped her red-tipped fingers on her apron before reaching up. Look, Mama, a new mizrap for Papa. A 9-beat song pulsed through my wings. A musician? What luck! If my quill could pull laments from the strings of an oud, I thought then my heart might heal. That quill is for your brother, the mother said. It's time that Shahen learned to play. A young musician? More luck. Far beyond this beetled field, where river cut through mountain, a curly-headed, big-eyed boy shivered when she spoke. Shahen, suns here as eagles see. Fast green water flowed along the distant bank. An arc of giant stones rose from the riverbed, bending the current's forward force. Water seeped back behind these stones, forming a still pool for Shahen, his face reflected in the water, so delicate, like Sosi's. His thumb and finger curled round a flat, smooth stone. He bent his hand tight toward his arm. One fierce flick of his wrist sent the stone to water. It skipped 9 times like the beat of a song. Ripples spread to the top of the pool, then sank into its surface. Then to no one, to the air, perhaps to me, Shahen said, no one plays oud in America. My musician, what luck. I sold like water on stone and completed the revisions in 2012-2013 when I was living in Armenia as a Fulbright scholar. Eagles were everywhere. From Sadarabad to Echmiadzin to the currency to official seals to this one at Gerhard to the Cascade Steps. Now my Fulbright project, the narrative anthropology of aging in Armenia, grew straight out of Alzheimer's. My anthropological fieldwork there involved spending time with elders. They became the grandparents that I never knew. They also became part of my revision process. I met with them in soup kitchens, active senior groups, their homes, my neighborhood church. They passed down medicinal remedies to me, and they shared the stories of their lives with me. Here they are, introducing me to Chash. When I told the elders I worked with about my Armenian mother, they always opened up to me, so that now my mother's story and their stories have become intertwined. And when they learned about her dementia, they would ask, was she a genocide survivor? As though only trauma like that could create such memory loss. Now, old people in Armenia often lived alone, unemployment having sent their families to Moscow or elsewhere for jobs. And Greta was typical. She grew up in Goris, and now this is gonna get tiny for you to see. She grew up in Goris, and this is a cartoon that's about Alice and Greta, where Alice is in New York looking up at the buildings saying, big, and Greta's looking at the cave dwellings in Goris saying, meds. far more than oceans, lay between their cities, though they arrived almost simultaneously and spoke the same language when they weren't in school, and I know this is too small to see. Alice and Greta never connected until I went to Yerevan, the city I lived in during 2013. This is an image of Alice, of little Alice, when she was young. Her mother would send her to Central Park to gather plantains, a good medicinal remedy for wounds, but my mother was an immigrant child, and she was embarrassed by that, shamed by it. So during Alzheimer's disease, as Alice reverted to being a little girl again, I saw her relive the shame that she felt as an immigrant kid sent to Central Park to gather those plantains. And I remembered too how my mother, who was often sad, would send me outside with a weeding tool to remove the plantains sprouting up from our lawn. But each time I met with Greta, she would tell me of countless herbs and their medicinal properties and other remedies passed down through the generations to her. It was like Alice and Greta were meeting too, and it was healing for all of us. Now, healing in the context of an incurable disease might seem pretty strange to you if you believe, like Alice did, that science is the only way to understand sickness and health. But for an anthropologist, medicine isn't just science. It's a collection of beliefs and practices. And this picture here is a white-coated doctor, and what he's doing is spitting out in his sound balloon the way an EEG traces the electrodes in the brain. And there's a shaman talking about the spiritual system that American Indians have. So medical anthropologists look at medical systems as healing systems and know that what we have in our culture with scientific medicine is a medical system that excels at curing diseases. But that's not what healing is. Healing is something altogether different. Healing doesn't take place inside of someone's body. It doesn't involve surgery or taking a pill. Healing is about sharing your story with someone else and then letting our memories meet. And when we meet through story, we find peace and we can move on, even if we're sick or if we're hurt or if we're dying. So while biomedicine's really good at curing some diseases and sometimes can repair our bodies, it flounders with permanent hurts, troubles of the mind, things like dementia that are incurable or incapacitating and eventually lead to death. Those states are stigmatized and feared, as they are in the dominant dementia narrative. What we think about when someone has dementia is that they've lost their mind. They've become like a zombie. A body without mind, struggling, and loved ones just dealing with loss. Now, medical anthropologists have a way of describing that. We call that the stigma and the shame that surrounds a state that we're all afraid of as social death. Now, we're all accustomed to biological birth and biological death, emergence from the womb or that last beat of the heart. But every culture has a definition for when life begins and ends and for when personhood is conferred or taken away. So for example, when ancient Armenians brought food to the graves of their loved ones during those 40 days before the Hoki Hankist, that's because social death doesn't take place until 40 days after biological death. So you have to keep on feeding them. But in the case of stigma, or silence, or denial, there's social death surrounding a rejected way of being, and that's what happens with dementia. And this rejection echoes through the hallways of hospitals and schools and grocery stores. And this is where dementia and genocide connect. Dehumanization, that process of social death, is what happens in the beginning of a genocide. That's when the distance between us and them becomes so strong that the people are stripped of their humanity and it makes it possible for others to do things that they wouldn't normally do, like mass murder. So that dehumanization is a critical part of that. I realized, as I was working on Like Water on Stone, how lucky I was to be doing it in Yerevan. Whenever I needed to do more research at the Genocide Museum or Institute, I followed the ritual of walking. I followed the ritual that tens of thousands of Armenians do every April 24th, walking to Tzitsanakert and having their steps honoring those who marched in the Syrian desert. During those years, that year, Aleppo was ever present because of the influx of Syrian refugees. But most of all, what I felt was that I belonged in that city, a city where the hierarchy of blood percentages didn't pertain. No one ever thought about whether I was guess high or a quarter high or whatever. When I was on the street and my American husband wasn't with me, people spoke to me in Armenian first. So I wrote this book, really, to share our story with a wider public. So accordingly, when my editor asked me why Ardziv was allied with the Armenians, and how Ardziv could tell who was Armenian and who was Turkish, I knew I had to write the scenes differently. Because in my mind, the ideal reader, even though I want this book to be meaningful and healing for Armenians, I wanted American kids to be reading this book, American adults to be reading this book. I wanted Turkish people to be reading this book. I wanted Turkish Americans to be reading this book. And sure enough, what has happened is I keep on hearing from readers, I read your book and I went online and I learned about the Armenian Genocide. But I did have to figure out a way to make all of that make sense. And again, this is where Ardziv came in. Here's how Ardziv explains why he's allied with the Armenians. Ardziv: I circled above, watching Shahin swim in the river with the young drum caps. A drum cap, you can guess, is a fez. That's when I saw him, that boy, the drum cap with the toothy grin. He was with the man with the red drum cap and the stiff white beard, trimmed and combed and polished so it spread out and down like the feathers of a tail. That man shot my mate. The man clapped the boy on the shoulders where wings would have sprouted were he a bird. For 40 days my mate had stayed there on the nest till this brood had hatched. 3 eggs this time, with me bringing all the food and fresh pine sprigs. One by one the young emerged, in the order they were laid, their egg tooth breaking through the shell, their eyes partway closed, no true feathers, just gray-white down, and open mouths, open shut, open shut. She would never leave them in those early days. It takes 2 full weeks for eaglets to hold their heads up. For feeding, their mouths open shut, open shut. She was bigger, swifter, as are all females of our kind, but I was good for my size. That year I had brought so much food no chick would need to eat the other, so ample were my hunts. Young rabbit, marmot, skunk, which she shredded and fed into their open mouths, open shut, open shut. But eagles suffer when they cannot fly. As the young grew strong and their wings expanded and black-tipped feathers replaced their down, all the young ones' appetites peaked. It was time for her to fly again. I pushed her from the nest as I had done before, and she flew straight into a bullet. Now, Ardziv is not the only voice in this story. In fact, Shahin and Sosi and Mariam speak far more than he does. And again, it's all in first-person voices. And I want to just read to you a little bit so you hear each of their voices. And I want to read to you from the very beginning of the book. In the spirit of the Hushamadian website, how many of you are familiar with that project, the Hushamadian? Yeah, it's a beautiful reconstruction of life in the Ottoman Empire in 1914. And in order to show the genocide, the impact of it, we have to show what life was like beforehand. So this is going to give you a picture of life for Shahin, Sosi, and Mariam. before things happened. For Shahen. Come on, lucky stone, give me 7, not 9, not 8, 1 for each of them, none for me. Papa, Mama, Kevor, Misak, Anihit, Sosi, Mariam, me. 8. It can't be 8. Not the 8 arches of the Balu Bridge. I can't be stuck here with a fool for a father in a land ruled by Muslims. Priests just baa like sheep. My fate isn't here, sitting in church, learning of what was, not of what could be. My fate isn't here, grinding wheat into flour. That's enough for my brothers, big dolts with no dreams. Come on, stone, you're the lucky one. Papa, Mama, Kevor, Misak, Anihit, Sosi, Maria. Me. Stupid 8, stupid like Papa, who keeps his head in song. If he stopped playing the oud, if he looked instead of listened, if he stopped thinking we're all the same, that Christians like us could ever be free deep inside an empire ruled by Muslim Ottoman Turks, they have no place for us, not in their hearts. Papa should know this. He was alive in 1895 when Sultan Hamid first gave the orders to kill us, not me. He knows we pay double taxes and cannot vote. If he opened his eyes, if he stopped thinking of the world as a song with disparate parts always blending, he would know that my Keddy, my uncle, is right. All the way from New York, Mama's brother knows the truth. We should marry our own. If I go to New York with my Keddy, my face will be bristled at last, no longer the little one, twin to a girl with a fool for a father. There I'll grow tall, the bristles will come, I'll live in a tower that touches the sky. Come on, pink stone, perfect, smooth and flat, cut me out, make it 7. Stone spins and cuts the surface. Papa, big spray, Mama less, Kevor closer, Misak smaller, Anihit, Sosi Mariam. Stone sinks into water. I'll do it with care. As the proverb says, measure 7 times, cut once. That's how I will do it. I'm going to America. Mariam. 5-year-old Mariam. Feet up, feet down. Heels hit house. Feet up, feet down. Shahen, come home. Time to play the bird game. Time to play the bird game. Feet up, feet down. I sit, I wait. Feet up, feet down. He's here. Shahen's on the ground, his arms open wide. Time to play the bird game? Yes, he tells me. He always says yes. My wings pull back. Meg, yergu, yerek, 1, 2, 3, flap, flap, flap. I fly. My heart goes first down, 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 from the roof into Shahen's arms. He catches me. He holds me high. He spins me round and round like the mill wheel. I fly above. I am his little dove. Sosi. Mama teaches me how to bargain for fabrics. First, fingertips feel, fingertips texture and weight, face and voice silent. Never take first price. See what Turks have to offer, but buy Armenian cloth if you can. Never show which one you love. Go to see each merchant's wares. Compare and think and breathe in spices. Hot bite of cayenne. Fenugreek for basturma. Warm, strong taste of earthy cumin. Deep red paprika to make a paste. Crisp allspice for Monty's stuffing. Mahlaps, bitter, almond nip. We buy a bolt of woven wool, tight with pattern and warmth. Mama says the silks I love will wait till I'm a wife. Silks instead of Mama. Silks instead of home. I search for Vahan in the market. Sosi John, Mama says, a woman never looks. Fatma Bey Injali comes into the stall behind us. Special price for you today, Gavur, infidel, as though you need it already with all the best land. Mama places the bolt between them. Her left hip juts out like a ledge. She stares straight ahead, lips sealed. The Turk from the shop says to Fatima, The gavur are clevered with their money as he drops a coin into Mama's open palm. Teşekkür ederim. Mama thanks him, nose up, lips drawn tight like a hard wrinkled pit. I can buy my cloth from others if you like. The Turk bows his bald head low, the fringe of his hair around his crown like an upside-down bristle-black smile. No, madame, you must come again with your lovely daughter. The bolt and the price pleased us both. Good day then, Mama says, pulling me from the stall, past the other vendors, past the crowd, over the bridge, squeezing my hand, muttering, the bee gets honey from the same flower where the snake sucks her poison. She lets go only when we reach our orchard, spread along the river's edge. I said nothing to that snake, only because your father holds her husband Mustafa dear. As if I didn't have enough to worry me, with you making eyes at clockmakers' sons before fathers have even spoken. And Shahin, always wet from the river, he played with Turkish boys again, you know. The pair of you will be my end. And the nerve of that vendor, insulting us as we give him good money. So see, look around you, this is Armenia. Fat Turks from Constantinople rule for miles and miles, but these are our lands. Your father planted these very vines with cuttings from my father's arbors. His grandfather's grandfather planted the olives, his father the apricots. Nothing came free, not the millstones, not the earth, not the sheep, not the wheat. Generations of sweat, don't you ever forget. Grapevines, heavy with fruit, bend over straight wood frames. Silver olive leaves shimmer behind them. Apricots blush in the sun. I want to give Ardziv the last word because he ends up being the moral conscience of the story. I know when I first read this story, the first time I read it out loud in Yerevan, I was worried about describing the inter-ethnic marriage. And I loved learning through Hushamadian that in Palu, in fact, it was common. They're not common, but love matches happened between Armenians and Kurds, Armenians and Turks. It was a more integrated community. And what we see in our Shahin is a young man rebelling against his father, a young man who has to figure out a journey towards forgiveness. But here, I just want to read how Ardziv is making sense of this when he realizes what's happening. Ardziv. Green mountain fields turned into gold as wheatgrass curled and ripened. Harvest songs rose from the fields as sickles slashed the stalks. One August dusk, as the sun hung low and colors filled the sky, Mama and Sosie spread rich red cloth across the roof floor with platters of food upon the cloth. Rice wrapped tight with leaves from grapevines, cheese fibers pulled so thin they might not line a nest. Flat-baked bread from fresh ground wheat, the black pot filled with green pepper dolma, apricots, olives, and skewers of lamb, the juice of the meat still running red. Shahin carried Mariam on his shoulders, holding her round knees as he darted down the path to greet the guests. Mama flapped her arms above him like a baby bird, unbending her knees and rising at the sight of Anahid, who quickened her step when she saw them. I flew in quite close, not believing my eyes, at the sight of her husband and his parents behind her. They wore headscarves and prayer shawls. This was a family of Kurds. Kurds who pray with the drum caps, bowing south 5 times each day. Young Asan, the husband of Anahid, his parents, Kaban and Paliwan. Such hugging and laughter up on the roof, sharing the meal like one family. Imagine Kurds and Armenians together as if falcons and eagles had just become one. Last light faded from the sky as they ate, but surprises did not end. Another lone man came up the path with a curious slanted walk. He pressed and pushed to arrive, leading with his heart a dumbek drum, its sides inlaid with mother of pearl held tight against his body. His arm squeezed the drum's waist, the goatskin taut across its top. But something pulled him from the back of his legs as he moved forward. A round drum cap on his head said, no mistaking it. This Mustafa was a Turk. Imagine, like falcons and hawks right inside my nest. It was one of them. It had to have been a falcon or a hawk who came to my nest after the drum cap shot my mate. Tucked into a rock, high on a ledge, the nest could be reached only by one with wings. I had left them alone, the young ones. I had no choice. Their mouths were always open, open, shut, their flight feathers not yet full. I had waited in the nest till I spied a plump gray rabbit. Within minutes I was back, my beak full of flesh for them. But the nest was already empty. Hidden by night now, I dropped down to low branches as the music began. Soothing music, music soothing my sore heart. My quill plucked sweet sounds from the strings of the oud, drawing me in. Shahen too. Mustafa's steady hand beat his doumbek. Kaban's cheeks filled, emptied, then filled, the duduk sound unceasing with his constant breath. Lydian melodies like oil flowed, mother tongues in unison blending, thick umber of Turkish coffee, Armenian apricots, ginger ripe, Kurdish moonlight above us. Misak and Kevork stood, arms out, hands on shoulder, catching the beat of the song, the tamzara with their step. 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. Asan joined the line, now an arc, Mama and Palawan between them. 1, 2, 3, stomp, stomp. Shahen did not dance. He had only eyes for my quill. His lips turned up as Papa pulled my quill across the strings. But as the song ended, Shahen jumped up. Sosi too, they pulled Anahi to her feet to make her dance with Asan next. The young couple wound around each other like eagles courting, though one of them had falcon blood. Talons locked, cartwheeling through the sky, the line between their eyes never breaking, the melody of the slow, sweet song twisted and turned around itself, our eyes all on them. Mustafa, tender and sweet, Kaban and Papa proud, Misak and Kevor dreaming. Mothers blushed, children shushed. Sounds of the stream on the stone and the wood filled the air till Papa rose to stand, his hand across his heart. My wife's brother is a faraway fool to hold back his blessing for Anahid and Asan. Here it is clear, you men are my brothers. Our holy books differ by one prophet only. The sun does not shine on one man and his family, keeping others in the dark, even in New York. When falcons or hawks came to my nest, I must confess, I sang a different song. In May of 2013, the 9th month of my stay in Yerevan as a Fulbright scholar, Dr. Ugur Ümit Üngur delivered the annual commemorative lecture on the Armenian Genocide at the American University of Armenia. His topic, the memory of the Armenian Genocide and Turkish identity. Now, Üngur is an historian, Director of Graduate Studies at the Institute of War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies at the University of Utrecht. And he's documented how the current wealth of Turkey developed from assets seized from Armenians as they were forced from their homes or killed. He told the story of how he found his life's work. While he was a university student, he came home one day for vacation, and there was a show on Turkish television about Turkish history. And when it ended, his grandmother turned to him and said, "That's all lies. Let me tell you what really happened, what was witnessed by Turks." And this set him on the path of doing the academic work that he did. He introduced this crowd to Stanton's model, the 8 stages of genocide that I mentioned earlier. How many of you know this model, work with this model? Much. It's only one. It's a wonderful model, and I learned of it first from a Turkish scholar, which was really, really fun. And then I discovered that it's an anthropologist behind it. He divides genocide up into 8 phases: classification, that division of people into us and them. Then there's symbolization, the elaboration of identity with names or symbols, like the Jewish star during the Holocaust. Dehumanization, as I mentioned earlier, that social death, that removal of personhood that permits behaviors that are usually only reserved for animals. You have to call a human being not a human being in order to do the kinds of things that are done during genocide. Then there's organization, militias like the Chetes, so the government can deny the acts. And then there's polarization, hate groups that drive the people apart, the us and them, further and further apart. Preparation, as the victims are all identified and marched out into the desert or separated into ghettos. And then only then do you have the actual killing, the extermination, phase 7. But then the most important thing is that the last phase of genocide, of every single genocide, is always denial. Mm-hmm. And so there we are, here, celebrating, commemorating, not celebrating, but commemorating and honoring the 100th anniversary of not events of the past, but something that is still ongoing. Because until denial ends, genocide is still ongoing. Now, how can I be talking about common humanity and then at the same time saying we need to recognize the real truth? Well, that's because I believe that when you're writing fiction and you're doing research, you're getting at a different kind of truth. You're getting at a truth that really matters. You're getting at truth in the form that the scholar William James, the philosopher William James has said, is that you can measure truth by the behavior that comes out of it. You can measure truth by the facts, by the behavior that it inspires. The ultimate test for us of what a truth means is the conduct it dictates. And so this is the first kind of truth that we can reckon with. It's the one that inspires our conduct and our identity. We're still collectively telling the story that's the real account of who we are, what it means to be Armenian. And we may be mistaken by some for a people who didn't undergo a genocide, and we have to correct that. But we know that our identity holds so much more than the accounts of the genocide, which our culture has survived. This again ties back to dementia. We're here talking about wanting that to be recognized. In dementia, this is always what's going on. Whenever I tell somebody that my mother has dementia, what is the first question they always ask me? Does she recognize you? That for us is a definition of whether something's real or not. But even when my mother lived with us for several years, she would say things to me regularly like, "It's a good thing I ran into you in the parking lot. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't." So what I learned to do is separate her recognition of me, those specifics, that role, those facts, from her recognition that I was deep down good and someone I could trust. That identity, being her daughter, her recognizing me as her daughter, my identity also as a mother, as an anthropologist, as a wife, each one of these has a specific social role. And when Alice asks me things like, you know, are you my mother or my sister or my nurse? My experience with storytelling has gotten me to the point where that I know that it isn't that recognition of me or the recognition of events that ends up defining things. It's our intentions and our actions and our cores. It's what we do with this. This is the truth that I hope feels like water on stone. And I'm so grateful to all the scholars who've done the research that helps us build true stories. I believe in that core truth of knowing who we are, that we're a people who've survived a genocide, that we've mastered the bitterness, that we've found a place in our hearts to forgive individual citizens, and so that we don't fall into that same trap of dehumanization and classification, even when governments haven't done the same thing. We have the power of being bigger and better than that. Stories, like dreams, can encompass that complexity of conflicting realities. Stories can show us a young man, Shahed, learning to forgive his father for not letting him go to America and forgiving his father for all the events that take place in the book. And he blames his father at first, which is what young people so often do. Stories resist reducing individuals to categories. Stories make ourselves visible and known and understood. For both the tellers and the receivers, stories have the capacity to heal, particularly when both sides have stake in a narrative. So again, I would love to have the book translated into Turkish and have this be a book that can communicate back and forth and be a place for opening of dialogue. Stories can lead us to find ways to deal with the pain as characters manage to accomplish what seems unimaginable as in our own lives, which is just what I watched my mother do. They help us make peace and move on, even if we're sick, or we're hurt, or we're dying, or if our history's been denied. Thank you. Thank you for bearing with me. I finally just gave up because I knew I had so many slides with wonderful teeny tiny print that there was no way you were ever going to be able to see. So thank you for bearing with the technical difficulties.
Sorry about the technical difficulties, but after this poetic and deep presentation, any questions?
Yes. Questions?
It's not a question.
Sure.
My cousin's husband writes also on Barkes Dolabjan. Have you heard of him?
Not yet, but I'll look for him.
He's in Montreal, Canada.
Oh, well then he's very close to me.
Close to you, that's what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. I will look for him. I'll write his name down.
I remember one fact from it. He sent me a CD also, that Encyclopedia Britannica had first written about Armenian genocide. And then pressure or whatever, they took it out.
They took it out. Yeah, they took it out. And that's such a fascinating thing. How do you keep on standing for what's right? And I think that encyclopedias and politicians politicians can force encyclopedias to do various things, perhaps. But when you're writing fiction, you can stay truer to the truth in many ways. We have freedom of speech, and we can keep on saying what's important, and we must keep on doing that. And then that helps other people know the real stories. I mean, I've been really excited and heartened by how teachers are embracing this and getting it made a part of the curriculum, because I think silence is not what we want anymore. It's time. It's time for everyone to know. Thank you. Question. Here, use this.
No, I don't need that.
Okay.
I have a thick voice.
Oh, good.
So you mentioned that you don't remember much about your grandmother, except that she was very old. Did you speak any Armenian when you were little for your grandmother?
No. My grandmother died before I was born. And when I was little, my mother spoke only English. So I knew words like lolik. I mean, I knew foods, basically. That was it. So I didn't, we'd sometimes go to relatives' houses, and I'd hear it in the background, but really, we spoke only English. It wasn't until college that I learned any Armenian.
And you said you picked up Turkish language when you were in Turkey, and you even spoke it? I'm amazed at that.
When you're in your 20s, it's relatively easy to learn languages.
But how long was it that you stayed altogether in Turkey?
In Turkey. When I was a child, I lived in Brazil. And it opened up a place in my brain to get into an environment and start speaking, even if there are lots of mistakes. So what my husband and I did, we just studied a lot of tourism vocabulary. So it wasn't like we had great language skills. You know, we would arrive in a place and we'd say, "Sicak sur var," so we'd ask if there was hot water. "Livar," are there beds? You know.
Do you know how to say that in Armenian?
Now I do, yeah. Hima hayren khosumem, բայց շատը խալները գավ, անպայման, բայց հայերեն խոսում եմ հիմա.
Another question. How did you find an American husband who plays the oud?
Each the way that happened is through my mother. He was a classical guitarist, and when he got introduced to George Mogroditchian's music, and then to George Mogroditchian because he happened to live in the same area and then became friends with my mother, he said, that instrument's gorgeous, I have to learn. So I think it was the love and the connection to Armenianness that made him learn to play the oud. Okay. So yeah, it was the husband first, the oud second. Great question. Hi.
A great presentation, by the way. When you were in Armenia, did you have a lot of interaction with people who did have Alzheimer's?
Oh, that was such a fascinating experience. I would have two different kinds of things happen. I would have people come up to me and say, we have no Alzheimer's in Armenia. And then I'd have people come to me and say privately, it was so miserable when my mother or father had dementia because it's so stigmatized that we couldn't really get any help, that we were just alone and isolated with it. So I did see people in their homes with memory loss. I spoke with neurologists and really got a sense of what it was like. I worked, there was a series of interesting profiles done about dementia in Armenia at that point in time too, and there was one family who really shared their story about what it was like to have early onset dementia and be so alone and isolated. So it really was a fascinating kind of a thing to witness. In Armenia, there's a lot more stigma around any kind of mental illness. I would also learn at that time about sort of how epilepsy, another neurological condition, is handled. So people who have epilepsy really truly keep it hidden because